So, as you know, it's the year of India's G20 presidency, and the country has a renewed global platform to showcase what the government calls the India First agenda, which is a much more strident view of positioning India on a global stage. During COVID, we saw India becoming the pharmacy to the world with its production of COVID vaccines. At COP platforms, including in Scotland and elsewhere, India has provided leadership to the global south. India has been managing conflicting objectives between the European Union and the US on one side, and then allies in Russia and elsewhere on the other side. It's taken a more strident diplomatic stance against China's aggression on the border. Just recently, a G20 meeting in Bangalore ended in discord as Russia and China refused to condemn the Ukraine war, outlining the deft balancing act that the Indian External Affairs Minister and South Bloc needs to have. So this session is very much about India's role on a global geopolitical stage, what India's historic stance of non-alignment means in today's world, and how that might change. What I want to do is just ask each of our panelists, starting from Supriya, moving through, for some opening remarks on this topic. And then I've got a few questions for them, and then I want you, in the meantime, as the audience, to think about all the difficult questions you can, all the things that you wish you could ask them, but you haven't been able to, and we'll make this a barnstormingly fun panel. So, Supriya, over to you first.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here, and it's a good morning and a sunny morning here in London, which is always something to look forward to. I think it's a very pertinent topic, India's position as a global superpower, and no better time than to do it now. I stand here, in fact, I sit here as a representative of a very confident India. But an India that became confident and an India that started off being confident and being assertive since 1947. I think we started off as a very unique experiment since 1947 when we spoke about a constitution that was built on pillars that hold us true even to date, a constitution that unapologetically talks about being secular, being democratic, being socialist. And I think these are values that we celebrate. These are values that also make us a global superpower. I mean, imagine 1947, a whole host of countries around that time had become independent post the Second World War. Many people had predicted that we were destined to fail. What kept us united, what kept us together, and what juxtaposed us to being a global superpower, I think is the belief and the foresight and the farsight that founders of our country, that makers of our constitution had, and that was that India will have a place in the world if India continues to be secular, India continues to be democratic, and India continues to be socialist. And I think these are virtues that we don't just celebrate, these are virtues that have enabled us to have a large economy, that have enabled us to have a say at the high table, that have enabled us to get foreign capital, that have enabled us to have investments flow in. And I think these are issues, these are virtues that we don't just need to preserve, these are virtues that we need to embed, these are virtues that we need to accelerate, and these are virtues that we need to celebrate. So I am very happy talking about a global superpower that India is, but please understand, India's foreign policy, you mentioned G20, and which is why I'll refer to that before I close my opening comments. G20, being a rotational presidency, yes, we have a G20 happening in India, good, we cheer it, we celebrate it. I'm going to be more focused on what outcomes come out of it, but I'm equally happy that India has a say on the high table of the G20. The fact that India is a part of this high-valued group, which has a huge say in global economic policies and policies around climate change, in global trade and all of that. I mean, 80% of world's GDP is represented by G20. The fact that India is a member of it, and we didn't become a member of it now or in the last decade, we've been a member of this for several years since inception. And I think those are reasons why India continues to be a global superpower. Our foreign policy, for instance, you mentioned Russia, you mentioned Europe. Our foreign policy, for instance, was the bedrock of the foreign policy is non-alignment. Imagine a nascent, independent nation that India was, and we still chose to not be aligned with either the US or the USSR back then. The two big power blocs that were at war with each other, we chose to put our interest first and talked about non-aligned movement. I'm very happy that that non-aligned movement continues to be the deep roots of our foreign policy. It has not really weathered away from there. We put our interests first, and that is how it should be.
Wonderful.
Well, first of all, many thanks for having me here, and many thanks to those of you who've chosen to sacrifice a sunny day in London and braved a train strike to be here in this conversation. In a way, that's a sign of the conversation we are trying to have, is that why India, whether it's a superpower or not, why India matters. So let me, in my opening comments, just outline 3 issues that I feel are important as sort of components of what we need to consider. The first is that, in order to be a superpower, the core ingredient has to be not just economic strength, but economic resilience. And it's economic resilience at a macroeconomy level, but also at a microeconomic level, in the sense of, how households transform their life chances. And this is where the transformations that have been happening in India over several decades, starting with the economic reforms in 1991, and then a series of different economic interventions over the years, is important to keep in mind. So you see this as an arc of history in at least India's economic history as it is changing. But equally, how India then develops the resilience against shocks. So we had one economic crisis in 1990-91, but we were also buffeted by the Asian financial crisis in 97-98. Then we were affected by the global financial crisis of 2008, and then, of course, the pandemic that unfolded from 2020 onwards. So you can almost imagine every decade there is going to be a shock that's going to hit us. And the measure of our resilience is how, not what we do before or after the shock, but how quickly can we bounce back, and can we bounce back better, right? So that is one issue that we should keep in mind. The second issue, and it won't be a surprise given that I come from an institution called the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, is that these shocks will be compounded by a global crisis called climate change. It's not that India has contributed to it, but India is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And therefore, how India uses these shocks as a lever to transform not just its energy system, but to transform its economic structure, is going to be another measure of its superpower status. Why do I say this? I say this not to point fingers, but to simply present you the argument that the advanced countries of the world and the latest superpower in terms of China's economic strength have followed a linear developmental pathway. India will be the first major economy that, if it succeeds in its energy transition, will demonstrate to the rest of the global south that you can grow an economy, and you can also transform its energy system, and you can create jobs, effectively what we call jobs growth and sustainability, as a simultaneous process of economic development rather than a sequential one. And this will be another measure of its success or failure, and the lessons from that experience will be relevant for the rest of the world. And finally, we are, of course, having this conversation not just in India's G20 year. We're very happy to discuss those issues, but we're also having this conversation nearing the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, or the post-Second World War era. And why I draw attention to this is because multilateralism is under strain. And what India does or does not do, whether through sort of plurilateral platforms like the G20, or whether through minilateral platforms that it is part of, or whether through multilateral platforms, will matter. Not just because of the size of its economy or the size of its population, which is now the largest in the world, but also because of the values that it then can bring to the table. So what is the new kind of multilateralism that India and like-minded countries can promote. What is the new form of cooperation against the shocks of the future, not just the economies and the challenges of the past. Those are, again, the measures of innovative thinking, but efficient delivery on the promises made. So if we think of superpower status and break it down into these issues of economic resilience, response to the climate crisis as an existential crisis for us and the planet, and a new approach towards reformed and effective multilateralism, then we can come back year on year and see how much progress we've made.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be back at a Bridge India event again. Patrick, thank you for inviting me to come along. And my fellow panelists, of course, have looked at India from an Indian point of view and from a place in the world point of view. And I just wanted to look at it from a region of the UK point of view, if I can. So I, for those of you who don't know me, was the First Minister in Northern Ireland, and I wanted to bring you my experience of working with India over the years through economic development, cultural ties, the fact that we are working together in relationships that work. And I wanted to just reflect on that for a few minutes before we got into the question and answer session. I spent some time with an Indian company that has modestly invested in Northern Ireland and now wants to invest in a more meaningful way this week. And we were reflecting on the fact that India is such a global superpower now. They could very easily become quite insular and do things just in their own space. But I think the advantage of looking out to the world, looking out to the globe, is something that they very much want to do. So they're bringing their experience of how they dealt with issues in India to Northern Ireland. You may think that is a little strange, given that the UK has always prided itself on being ahead in a lot of areas. But this company believes in investing in my part of the United Kingdom for a number of reasons. First of all, they believe in this technical and digital world in relationships. And I think it's very important that we don't move away from that, because yes, we are the most connected that we have ever been. The world is a much smaller place now because of technology, because of digital connectivity. But relationships still matter. And we were reflecting on that and the fact that in my part of the UK, which is still quite a conservative part of the UK with a small c, I have to say, we value family, we value relationship, we value integrity, and therefore it is important that we reflect that as we do business with our colleagues in India. I was Enterprise Investment Minister in Northern Ireland for over 7 years, and during that time we developed a strong relationship with different parts of India, because I recognize the enormity of India and its people, that it's best for small places like Northern Ireland to do things on a region-to-region basis. And I was very much involved in that, visited on a number of occasions, and what I felt very strongly was the fact that because we had this relationship synergy, that we could do business together. And we're going to talk about India's place in the world, its presidency of the G20. We're going to talk about all of those macro issues today. But at the heart of it is relationships. And I think that is very important to remember. And it's one of the reasons why I feel so strongly aligned with the British Indian community here in the UK, and the fact that we do value friendships, relationships, integrity. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much to each of our panelists. Supriya, coming to you, India's foreign minister, from friends in the British Indian diaspora I have and elsewhere in the British community, people often say to me, India's current external affairs minister is so much more strident. He's always on YouTube. There's always clips of him on Instagram. He's just much more ever-present than India's foreign diplomats ever were. And he's positioning India with a level of pride that maybe wasn't there before. Is that an assessment that you agree with? Or The flip side of it is that The Economist wrote an article just a few weeks ago that said actually behind all the nationalism and some of the chest thumping from the Indian government, India's foreign policy is actually pretty much the same today as it was in previous administrations.
So being the head of social media and digital platforms for INC, I'll be very happy to see more and more politicians being active on the platforms that you mentioned. Great going. But I think at the end of the day, any minister, whether it is the Minister of External Affairs or for that matter, any minister in India, what really counts is what do you stand for and what are you championing? I welcome anybody being strident, I welcome anybody being assertive, being social media friendly. But I also want to assert with unequivocal assertion that the reality is that India's foreign policy is deeply rooted in the non-aligned movement policy that Pandit Nehru had laid down. There is no looking away from that. I mean, back then, it's good for us to today look at our interests first. We are not aligning with either Russia or US or China or anybody else. But the reality is that back then in 1947, when we had just become independent after the 200 years of colonial rule, we had the wherewithal, the foresight, the farsight to say we are going to chart our own path as far as foreign policy is concerned. And I don't think our foreign policy has withered away from there too much. I think the foreign policy remains pretty same to that. I would see foreign policy make more noises about India. I would want foreign policy to be less about certain corporate houses and more about India's public sector undertakings, public sector institutions. But I agree with the second assessment that our foreign policy is so deeply rooted and so inspired by the non-aligned. We may not use the word non-aligned anymore, but back then during the Cold War era, we chose not to be aligned. And I think that is the bedrock of our foreign policy. We haven't walked away from that at all. And that was a foreign policy laid down by none other than Pandit Nehru himself. And successive governments, whether my party or the opposition, have followed that. So that tells you that there's something good about the foreign policy and it has served us well.
I remember on Netflix there's a new show called The Diplomat, and it's about a female US ambassador to the UK. And her husband, who also used to be an ambassador before, makes a speech at Chatham House where he's talking about what economic diplomacy means. And he says, diplomacy is about getting into the same room with the same people again and again and not achieving anything for years until you do. And then it's incredible. With India's interventions in COP, particularly in renewables and climate change, the areas that you were talking about earlier, has that been your experience, that India has very much been saying for decades that climate change is a problem created by Western countries, imposed on us, we're suffering. And maybe in previous years, Western powers haven't listened so much to India, but increasingly on COP platforms, maybe India is having a bigger voice and the global south is having a bigger voice. Is that an assessment you would agree with?
There are, in 1970, Albert Hirschman wrote that book, Exit, Voice, or Loyalty. Right? You engage with any kind of platform if it delivers you, on your interests. You express your voice, you are loyal to that platform, or you exit if it doesn't. When it comes to climate negotiations, there are two kinds of voice that the global south can have. One is the voice of climate justice. The second is the voice of climate action. I think what India has managed to demonstrate now is that its voice on climate justice that has been there for a long time is now coupled with its voice on climate action. Right? And therefore what you're bringing to the table is a lot more in terms of not just we are asking you to do more, but you're also bringing to the table, we are doing a lot more than you thought we were doing. Now, what are you going to do in return? Right? Now, let's just expand on this very quickly. If you look at renewable energy, in our National Action Plan on Climate Change began in 2008. Our solar mission began in 2010. At that time, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. Today, we have well over 60,000 megawatts of solar. And we have nearly 180,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity. aiming for 500,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity by 2030. It'll be, if India manages to do this, and of course nothing is on autopilot, there's a lot of investment and manpower and technology that will be needed to be put in on the ground. But if India manages to do this, it'll be the first major economy that will build more clean energy infrastructure within a decade than its entire electricity system existed at the beginning of the decade. Now, this is climate action coupled with the fact that climate justice has not gone off the table. So when I was talking about being buffeted by crises, when we talk about hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, or we think of, cyclones that are emerging in our Arabian Sea rather than in the Bay of Bengal, these patterns that are changing are impacting small, vulnerable communities and small and large economies. So this means that in addition to COP negotiations, it's these other multilateral platforms that India also is promoting. The International Solar Alliance, which now has 114 member countries. The idea is what? The sun shines, not in London, except days like today. It shines primarily between the tropics. So if you don't aggregate the demand between the tropics where emerging markets, developing countries lie, you're not going to really scale up solar. Equally, there is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is on the resilience side. That how do we build the infrastructure that developing countries need, India needs, but as does Bangladesh, as does Thailand, as does Kenya, as does Barbados. How do you make that infrastructure far more resilient? So this combination of the voice of climate justice and the voice of climate action is what will enable India and its partner countries to drive more of the change that we've not witnessed, unfortunately, for nearly 3 decades since the UNFCCC was first negotiated.
Arlene, how do you see, sitting outside India, how do you see India's assertion of its geopolitical power versus how it's perhaps perceived in Westminster or elsewhere?
Well, I think that the move from being the 6th largest economy to the 5th largest economy came up on a lot of people in the UK, and they didn't expect it to happen, but it happened. And I think when that did happen, that sent a very strong message to the UK to swap those positions between 5th and 6th for the UK and India, and it got attention in the UK in a very meaningful way. But in terms of the G20 and India's place in the world and the challenge that they lay down to the West, in inverted commas, they also have a very important leadership role, as far as I'm concerned, in sending a message to China. And we're probably going to touch on China, I'm sure, and about the relationship or non-relationship that there is there at the moment between India and China. And whilst the West hasn't made as much progress as they would have liked in terms of climate action and in terms of climate change, China certainly haven't made any changes that are of significance in terms of climate action and climate change. And because we are this connected world, Gulf of Mexico you referenced in terms of hurricanes and what have you, if China continues on the platform that they're currently on, then the rest of us will not be able to move ahead in terms of dealing with climate change in the way that, and we're just talking about climate change because my colleague talked about that, but there are other issues in connection with that as well. China has now put itself out in the world, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in a very meaningful way, and have made themselves very important partners. And because they have done that, that then has an impact on those countries, how they see the UK, how they see India. And I think we need to be aware of that, because geopolitics is now something that affects our everyday lives. Therefore, we have to understand that what India does, what China does, what Russia does in terms of what it's doing in the Ukraine has huge impact for us here in the UK. And the idea of isolationism, I think, is absolutely something that, even if you believe that you're a big enough country, you have supply chains within your country, you don't need to interact with other superpowers, that's simply not going to work in the future, because we are such a connected world now, and you've seen that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the impact on energy prices right across the world was immense in terms of grain distribution. So we are a very connected world. I think India understands that we are a very connected world. That has been shown through their continued presidency of the G20, and when they have their leaders meeting in September, no doubt the leaders will come together. And sometimes, you know, those leaders meetings are a showpiece. There's not as much work done at those meetings as there is in the run-up to those meetings. But I think when we have the leaders meeting in the G20, we will see just what a connected world we live in. And I think the UK understands that. They certainly understand the power of India now, and indeed the diaspora of India as well, because you and I have been at many meetings where the strength of British India have been felt very much, and I acknowledge it very much in the future as well, and the power that it's going to exhibit here in the UK.
I want to ask one more question, but after that, I want to throw it open to the audience. I know there's one hand up, and if anyone else has questions, just Zarira as well. Sanjay, good. We've got plenty of questions. Wonderful. So I'll keep my question very short, but I wanted to pick up on what Arlene just said about China. So Ukraine has certainly, the war in Ukraine has certainly been the major, or one of the major geopolitical issues in the world. India's government has argued, when Europe has said, you know, you need to be on our side in the Ukraine conflict, India's government has argued, well, China has been encroaching on our border lots of times over the last few years. And that Europe sees as very much India's problem. Why should Ukraine be not just Europe's problem, but the world's problem? How do you react to that, Supriya?
No, I think it's very simple. I think our position on foreign policy, our position on Ukraine has been articulated by a government. I may be a member of the opposition, but a view that comes from the government of India is a view that India shares at the global stage. I don't think this is a platform where I'm going to contradict or question the stand taken by my government. I think fair enough, this is a stand by the government of India which has the mandate and is representing the people of India. I actually wanted to, if you allow me briefly to take a point from what she said, about trade and global opportunities being so connected. Yes, we live in a very, very global world. We live in a world where funds are not flowing regionally. We live in a world where investments and funds are flowing from one continent to the other. We live in a world where fund flow is happening globally. And I think because we are talking about the G20, because we are talking about India as a global superpower, we've got to be mindful of the fact that one of the reasons why India is a preferred investment destination or has attracted investments is because we have a resilient democracy, because we are a secular nation, because we have the rule of law and order, because there is jurisprudence, because there is a media that does scrutiny. And I think which is why there may be times when Indian democracy appears weak. And I will not shy away from the fact that the disqualification of Sri Rahul Gandhi from India's parliament is one such moment. The way it happened, what triggered it, the means to achieve it, that's another debate. But I think the resilience of the Indian democracy is what I celebrate. And I think the resilience of the Indian democracy needs to be protected, needs to be enhanced, and needs to be accelerated. So when you talk about a global superpower, we are none of that without the resilience of our democracy and without the social fabric being intact.
And on democracy, I think one conversation I was having with some colleagues in Paris a few weeks ago is, in India, regardless of what elections you have, whether panchayat elections or general elections, you have a turnout of 70% plus, whereas in Europe, when we were in the EU, I'm not sure I knew who my member of European Parliament was. And the turnout in the European Parliament elections was probably 20% in my constituency, maybe even less than that. So the nature of India's democracy is much more raucous and much more vibrant, but certainly it is, as the Vice President of India said in London, not so far away from here, just a week ago, no, in fact, earlier this week, it is the world's biggest and most vibrant and dynamic democracy. But the nature of that is very different from what it is here. So let me take, because the mic's on this side of the room, let me take two questions first together, Sanjay and Ganesh, and then I want to go behind that. So Sanjay first, and then Ganesh, and then we'll take these two together.
Well, I'm not aware of any agreed definition on what is a superpower. And Shubhra mentions interestingly that India will not be a superpower without its democracy and social fabric. I would think that in the absence of any agreed definition now or in times to come, most likely, the vague notion what constitutes a superpower is two possessions. One is enough wealth, and the second is enough ICBMs. India has neither. A rising power, certainly, and to be welcomed on its way. Superpower, I don't know. But not to drag on about this issue of what you call it and the names you use, the fact is that if India has ambitions, aspirations to be a superpower, and it's on its way, it is a rising power undoubtedly. The principal impediment on that path seems to be China. That seems to be containing India militarily and economically. Do you think Indian democracy and Indian policy and Indian resources will have the resilience to get past China?
So I'm not going to make this an India versus China debate, but I certainly think that India has what it takes to be a superpower, to take your point forward. And I'll tell you why. Unlike China, we have a course correction that our democracy offers. I mentioned one mistake a moment when Indian democracy appears weak. Yes, our democracy appears weak when parliament doesn't function. Yes, our democracy appears weak when opposition is hounded by agencies. Our democracy does appear weak when opposition is jailed. Our democracy does appear weak when the most vocal voice of India's opposition is disqualified. But I think there is a course correction, and I will take a cue from election results that are due tomorrow from the southern state of Karnataka. And by all exit polls, it seems the ruling dispensation is going to be defeated. And I think that's the course correction that I talk about. I think that's the course correction that exists in India. I think India, with all its complexities, all its diversities, has been able to chart a course for itself. You look at the number of programs, whether it is poverty alleviation, whether it is pulling 270 million people out of poverty between 2005 to 15, whether it is economic liberalization. I mean, many such decisions have come out of India, despite the fact that there is huge diversity even more than what exists in all of Europe. So I'm not going to talk about India versus China. Do I want more to happen on that front? Absolutely, there is no denying that. Do I want some tough lessons to be taught to China? Absolutely. Do I want my import from China to be reduced any given day of the week? But do we have what it takes? 100%.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Ganesh. I'm representing Indian community in UK. My question is, considering we are the largest country in the world now, and we just became the 5th largest economies as well. So I think the time, isn't it the high time now to work on the synergies between UK and India? I'm sure policy has been working as well. And yesterday we heard Nigel Huddleston talking about free trade agreement. And also in the energy sector, I think considering even the geographic situations as well, and also in terms of the demographic people as well, 65% of Indian population is under 35 age. And looking at UK population, if you look at the percentage of youth in UK versus percentage of youth in India, I think it's the high time now to look at the synergies. And what is your take on how can we elaborate on these synergies and become more bilaterally, even more friendly, even more whatever we are doing, probably not enough. And probably we have to do more to bring it, become as a union together to make sure, we are going to hit bigger numbers soon. Because if we are going to delay this, we're going to miss the bus. So I think it's the high time now to work on the synergies. I'm so looking forward to the FTA. I don't know what's going to come up as well. But yeah, what's your take? I think the question is to all three panelists, because I think the synergies I'm talking about, energy, demographics, and the countries together as bilaterally agreements and all that stuff, yeah.
So I think it's not just about economic ties, which of course are very important, and to the point about what is a superpower, it's about your economic place in the world, but also the influence you exert in the world, and that's where India is coming up. But in terms of building those relationships, yes, economics is important, But historic ties are important, having those discussions, some of them difficult discussions, let's be honest about it, but also the cultural and educational ties as well are very important. So I'm very proud of the fact that Queen's University in Belfast, which in the past didn't have very many South Asian students, and it now has over 1,000 South Asian, the biggest actually cohort of students come from there now, not China, which it was in the past, but actually from India. And that sort of integration in the student numbers is very important. Culturally, Jaipur Literary Festival, coming to Belfast, having that interaction at a cultural level is very important as well. And the thing that I talked about at the start, relationships, having those interpersonal relationships, going to India, coming to the UK, having that understanding of the different cultures is hugely important. And the digital world has made that possible. Yes, I accept that. But there's nothing to substitute actually going to the place itself and experiencing that for yourself. I've been very privileged to do that, and I hope to do it much more in the future as well.
If I could take a minute to respond to that question. You know, you use the phrase high time. I mean, I don't know, that suggests that we have not been, you know, in contact between the two countries, and that's obviously not the case. And there's obviously a huge amount that can be done. The question is, what are we doing which is oriented towards the future? And if you think about the future, of course, you know, we can't predict it, but if you had to take a stab at prediction, you have to shape it. Now, the future is, from my perspective, going to be increasingly decentralized, increasingly digitalized, and increasingly decarbonized. Now, then the question arises, what is it that India and the UK can do together? What is it India and other major economies across the world can do together in those three pillars? Right? Why do I say decentralized? Global supply chains have to be much more resilient, much more reliable. And so decentralized does not mean each economy becomes its own vertically integrated firm. As a trade economist, I can say that that would be a terrible thing in terms of efficiency and cost, and it would impact the poorest a lot more. But does concentration of supply chains in the manner it has emerged through a certain version of strategic industrial policy that then leaves us vulnerable, the right way to go? No. And that's why we have to think about what are the ways in which we can decentralize and yet have interdependent trade relationships. The same applies to the digital platforms. Now, the digital platforms, as they're emerging, and the way India is trying to use the digital revolution for developmental purposes, it also ties in with the advances in technology. And do we have the rules in place globally to govern those technologies that don't then result in new crises that will emerge? So that is again a point of conversation that needs to happen in addition to the development of technology. And finally, on the decarbonization point as well, and that's where, again, if you look at supply chains, we've just done some work for the G20, you see that over the past decade, as the number of countries that are investing in renewables has gone up, the number of countries that have more concentrated imports of clean energy products has also gone up. Now, that is not an energy secure future. So you will have to have a decarbonization story that is also tied up with a more distributed supply chain story. So I don't want to get into the specifics of what therefore India and the UK can do under an FTA, but we have to start thinking about what does the future broadly look like, and then where are the strategic opportunities of intersection between India and other major economies.
Wonderful. Let's get a quick question from Tim, and then I'm going to come on this side.
Hi, Daniel Haynes from the University of Bristol. How important are India's relations with its smaller neighbours to its global status? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Who wants to take that?
Okay, I will. I think all relationships are important, whether big or small. And I think India has always had a tradition of fostering these relationships. And which is why I keep going back to the non-aligned foreign policy of India, that we keep our interests over everybody else. We don't align with any superpower, big or small. We do our own thing. And I think that's how foreign policy should be. That's how foreign policies are made. And that foreign policy, which started way back in 1947, has held us in good shape for the last 75 years. So why would we walk away from that? And we are not.
So just to ask a question about that and have an interaction about that. I mean, when you say non-aligned, you mean it's driven by values as opposed to aligning with different superpowers. As someone who has a neighbour who is a neutral party, the Republic of Ireland is a neutral state and never takes up a position in relation to defence. It's non-aligned as opposed to neutral, isn't that right?
I think it's non-aligned in keeping our interests first, and that's the bedrock of our foreign policy. At any given point of time, what serves India best should determine our foreign policy, and that's how we take it.
Sure.
So I've got lots of hands still up, and our next panel is imminent to start. So let's take two very quick questions, just a one-liner question. Let's take them both together, and then I'll come to the panel for very brief comments. So one here, and then immediately there. So one here.
Yeah. Keeping in mind India's economic nature and its dependence on fossil energy as a developing economy, phasing out coal has been the better option over immediate elimination. However, that stance generated significant negative feedback in the Paris Climate Conference, particularly from the United Kingdom. Under your evaluation, is that an unrealistic expectation from India, or is that a just complaint?
Let's take one more question from Zareen, because he's been patiently holding up his hand, and then we'll get some comments from the panel. Yeah, just there.
Thank you. This is a question for Mr. Ghosh to do with the environment and what you were talking about. Could you give us a little bit of a picture in terms of the border, India's border with China, right? And what's taking place climatically over there, right, in terms of water supply? And that's always been something which has been concerning India, that could China actually effectively use that as a lever against India in terms of water supply, because a lot of the water comes from there into India.
Sure.
Okay, let me answer both those questions. The phase out, phase down issue came up in Glasgow, and then it came up again in Sharm el-Sheikh. And in fact, India put forward a position in Sharm el-Sheikh which said, why only phase out coal? Why are we not phasing out oil and gas? So you cannot cherry pick the fuels that have, drive your economy and say, no, this is all right, but your fuel is bad. What you have to look at the margin, what is the choice being made? At the margin, in the middle of the pandemic, when the entire economy was shut down, the renewable energy construction sector was one of the first sectors that India opened up and said, labor can go and continue building power plants. At the margin, over the last 6 years, investments in renewables have far exceeded investments in thermal power in India. At the margin, India's now tenders are for round-the-clock renewable energy supply. It has priority dispatch into the grid. So you have to then look at, is India making a harder choice than countries that already have an advanced energy infrastructure? The answer, objectively speaking, is yes. The question on the issue of water. Now, I think water as a whole, I also happen to sit on the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, and one of the things we have to understand is that there is no climate action unless there's water action. And water will be one of our weakest links when it comes to the risks that climate will impose on us. Now, with regards to your specific question, the nature of the glacial flows, that has to be, of course, measured and monitored annually. But what I can say is when the foreign policy, when the relations have diluted, so to speak, a little bit, China withheld data on water flows coming into India. This happened way back in, I'm forgetting the exact year, I think in 2017 or 2018. So the point is, even to answer your question, I need the data, right? So if you're not going to engage, and I raised this point right at the outset about what is the kind of multilateralism that we now need to reinvent. We have to think about not multilateralism of common interests, but multilateralism of common aversions. We all have an interest in, or we all have a common aversion against a global pandemic. But we should have a common aversion against a far greater existential threat, which is climate change. And that is where we have to figure out ways in which we can share information, be more transparent, follow the rule of law, not just within our countries, but in multilateral platforms where certain countries don't unilaterally restrict supplies of critical minerals, don't unilaterally restrict supplies of clean energy products and services, or restrict data on critical resources like water. And only then we will be able to reinstate a degree and modicum of trust that is completely missing when it comes to global collective action on the climate.
If I had a magic wand, I would wish for lots of things, but one of the things I would wish for is following on exactly from your point, which is climate change is the biggest issue threatening this generation, next generation. And I would use my magic wand to wish that 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. news anchors in India spent several more hours talking about climate change action in urban India as well as the rest of the country. Unfortunately, I don't have a magic wand.
I wish you did, on the anchor bit certainly.
But can we give a huge round of applause to our wonderful panel?